I mentioned to the class that at the end of this section of videos, I would address two things. One was hexadecimal numbers, and the other was a mention of why I don't think that motion tweening is a good way for beginners. I'll do the hexadecimal in a separate video series and then let you know about that. But for now, what you're looking at is a Swift file where on the top you're looking at an animation that was created using classic tweening as a method, and on the bottom using motion tweening. So let's look at just quickly the difference between the two by recreating this flash animation. So the initial setup is the same. It's really just a difference of what you're animating. I'm going to take the shape tool, create my initial shape, convert that into a symbol by selecting it, clicking F8, naming it, keep it as a graphic symbol, click OK. We now have that existing in our library. So let's first do the classic tween that you should be familiar with by now. And I'm going to go ahead just to make the timing easy in this video and change its properties to 20 frames per second, because that was just 3 segments of a 1 second interval. So I just did an F6 here and here, and then I'll click here, shift click here, right click and create classic tween. Then I'll go to this frame and I'll move that up, go to this frame and put this in the ending position. So there's our animation, has everything minus the rotation. And I'm going to save that rotation for last because that's where the learning curve spikes as far as motion tweens. Now the beauty of motion tweens, and here I'll create a new layer for my motion tween. And in fact, let's go ahead and just name this. I'll call this CLS for classic and put top here so I know it's the top item that I'm looking at. And I'm going to go ahead and lock this so I don't accidentally put items on here. And then we'll call this MOT for motion and BTN for bottom. Go to the library, drag out the symbol that we'll be using here. Now here is the beauty of motion tweens. You just, similarly to a classic tween, you select, but in this case you want to select exactly on the frame. In fact, a lot of times you just start out a motion tween with just one frame, because notice you don't have another copy of the instance. And then right click and create motion tween. And if you needed to make this longer or shorter, you just click and drag. But watch how simple this is now. All I have to do is put the cursor where I want the next frame to appear, drag it into place, automatically creates the keyframe for us. Go here to the last frame, then click and drag where I want this to appear, and again automatically puts the frame for us. So far it was much easier creating the motion tween. Now let's go back to the classic tween. In between the first and last keyframes here, we'll go to properties and we'll put the clockwise rotation in there. So we now have that. Now here's where things get a little tricky. I'm going to try to do the same on my motion tween, and it lets me. It just looks a little bit different. So I just put in one for the rotate. Its direction defaulted to clockwise, but I could change that. I can, and what's nice is I can actually even enter an increment less than 0 or 360. But look at the difference. Even though we just click between these two keyframes, motion tween doesn't process this the same. So what we have to do is now go into the editing mode for this motion tween and tell it that that's not what we meant. And the way to do that now, and this used to be different in different versions, but in the newest versions what you do is you double click. Actually, you have to double click on the actual keyframe-ish area here, the frames of the motion tween, and it drops down this editing thing. And now what we have to do is hunt for, so I'm going to drag down the actual rotation. And anything that actually occurs in here will have a little color next to it. So that's, the change for the X. That's the change for the Y coordinates. And then for the rotation, it's this thing called Z here. And so what's happening is by default, it made the rotation start from 0 and go to 360 across the whole entire animation. So what I would then have to do is insert an anchor point. And so I just want to go right here under frame 20, insert my anchor point. Now another thing that's somewhat, maybe more complicated than you want is it actually puts a Bezier style anchor point where we could actually bend this curve, which is kind of nice in that you can, really give some subtle changes to what's going on here. But for the simple thing that we want, we really don't need any of that. So I'm going to click on this point again, and I'm going to take each one of its handles and bring it down towards the center so that it's just acting like a static point. And then what I need to do is say, okay, it starts out at 0 rotation. I need to keep it down to 0 all the way to the first frame, and then, or all the way from the first frame to the 20th frame, and then from the 20th to the 40th frame, then it can go from 0 to 360, and now it looks like the other animation. So this is why I stress that I think beginners should really learn with the classic tweening method. But after you learn classic tweening and you feel very comfortable with it, by all means, jump on into classic tweening. There's a lot to be said about the simplicity and the packaging of it, and dropping down to the more advanced aspects of it. So, but we have one semester, and there's so many other things we haven't even talked about, animated timelines yet and things like that. So one thing at a time. And while we're in here, just in case you are the experimental type, let me just show you one more thing that's really cool about motion tweening, and that is if you want something to follow an arc, like instead of just going from here to here in a straight line, we want it to follow an arc. That's all there is to it. You just click and drag on that little path that's there, and it will do exactly what you tell it to do. And at any time you want to add another frame, inserting an extra frame is just a matter of having the playhead or the mouse where you want that new frame to go, keyframe, and then just drag your object. And if I move the mouse out of the way, you can see there's a new keyframe there, and it's just gonna, just follow the very WYSIWYG-ish to a certain point until you get into some of these more complicated things like we mentioned with the rotation.